So I first got involved in this process thanks to Canada. So, you know, this is the book, if you can see it. I can't see if you can see what I'm seeing, but this is the book that was written on the Canadian and the Dutch experiences. The world's first Citizens Assemblies, as you've mentioned, were British Columbia and Ontario, and also the Netherlands. And they used my textbook on electoral systems, and they invited me to be an expert. And the relevance of that is that when Ireland had a major economic crisis in 2009, 2008, 2009, a huge crisis, a lot of anger in the streets, lots of very angry citizens, lots of protests, and various communities were trying to promote the idea that we should bring citizens into the room and include them in discussions about how we can, you know, change our political system to make it better. So that was the sort of context. And I was one of a bunch of political scientists who started to write opinion pieces and appear on the radio and TV. And we were saying, look, the British Columbians and the Ontarians have shown us how we can do this. We should do this in Ireland also. And as you said, Anita, what this culminated in was we then got some funding to set up our own organization called We the Citizens in 2011. We ran a pilot Citizens Assembly. We demonstrated then to the government leaders that it could work, and then they adopted it. So that's the background to this. And we have had two processes, as you've mentioned there, the Irish Constitutional Convention and also the Irish Citizens Assembly. So the first of these was in 2012 to 2014, and the second was in 2016 and 2018. And exactly as you describe it, it's a random selection of regular citizens from all across the country who are brought into the room. They are fed information by experts, so they hear from experts, they can question the experts, they can educate themselves on the issues, and then they sit in round tables and they have carefully facilitated deliberation about the topic that they've been asked to consider, and then they produce recommendations. And in the Irish case, this has you know, gone on now for a number of years, and it has produced some very important outcomes, which you may or may not know about. But the most big headline outcomes were a referendum in 2015 to introduce marriage equality. So we became the first country in the world to introduce marriage equality by a referendum, by vote of the people. And that was an outcome of the Constitutional Convention. And then in 2018, last year, a successful referendum on abortion, which is not an easy topic in a country like this. And that was one of the outcomes of the Citizens Assembly. So that's the sort of the context in Ireland. And I suppose in terms of what you outlined in terms of the Canadian situation, what would be perhaps helpful to appreciate is how did it happen? So how did it happen in Ireland? Well, it happened for a number of reasons. One, we had a crisis, and I suppose a crisis can be in any number of different ways. Brexit would be a wonderful example of a country in Britain where they should adopt a Citizens Assembly because of their crisis there. We had our economic crisis. I imagine a minority government where there's political instability, which is what you say could happen after your next election, could be a similar sort of context there where you have an element of uncertainty, political uncertainty, and that invites others into the room. And so it's an element of crisis, and then it's a receptive leadership. You need senior politicians to engage. We had in 2011 a newly elected Prime Minister who was receptive, who was prepared to accept that this was something to try. So perhaps after your next election, you might have the same sort of thing, a receptive leadership. And then the other thing is, how do you make sure that the politicians are going to listen? How do you embed this in such a way that the politicians are going to pay any attention to it? Because that was a big weakness, particularly in Ontario, where the political class just ignored it to a large degree. So when the referendum followed, and to a degree this was also the case in BC, the politicians weren't paying attention, the media didn't pay enough attention, and as a result, the referendums didn't have much chance. What kind of helped in the Irish case was that in the case of the Constitutional Convention, the first of our two processes, a third of the members were members of Parliament. So it was 2/3 regular citizens selected at random and 1/3 members of Parliament. And that really helped to embed it, because it meant that the politicians then who had been members of this, when it came to the Parliament, they spoke very positively about the experience. because they themselves have been members. And so once we had this fair wind, if you like, produced by that first process, this made it much easier for the second process to work. So that would be another sort of contextual piece that might be worth giving some thought to. How was it seen? How was the Irish process seen? The media were highly critical. The media, almost to a journalist, were highly critical of the process. The sort of criticisms you will always hear, and I've heard this so many times in so many different countries, is citizens are too stupid. You can't trust citizens to discuss complex things like your electoral system. They're just too stupid. That's the first criticism. The second criticism is we already have an assembly. It's our parliament. So why do we need to set something like this up? It's a waste of time, it's a waste of money, and it's just a delaying tactic. And the third criticism is it might work in a small country like Ireland, or it might work in another country for another reason. It would never work in our country. And those three criticisms you will always get, and you just have to move beyond that. You need to get the politicians from the political parties to buy into it. You need to get some of the more sentient journalists to try and turn up to some of the sessions, because once they're in the room and experience it firsthand, very often they themselves become converts. And you need a topic that is going to excite enough attention, and the electoral system would seem to me to certainly be one of those topics. I'm not sure if there's much else I can say at this stage, and whether maybe it might be better for me just to stop for a minute and see if there are any questions.
How long of a process was the assembly?
So it can vary. And, you know, the thing I would always stress is that we're still at an experimental phase. So the Irish cases are an experiment. The BC, Ontario, they were experiments. There's new ones happening all around the world right now. This is mushrooming as an idea. So, so the ideal is it should take as long as it needs to take. So in BC and in Ontario, it took a number of months. In Ireland, when they were discussing abortion, they took 5 months. And when I say 5 months, that's 5 meetings, 5 weekends, you know, roughly once a month, with a certain amount of reading material in between. So it depends on the topic. I think for electoral reform, the BC and Ontario cases of taking, from memory, 9 or 10 months is not a bad idea.
I think that what David said about however long it takes is really important, because what you don't want to do is have an assembly and then it's like they're 3/4 of the way there to designing your new system, and then it's like, okay, that's the end of the assembly. You know, we don't want that. We want, that's part of citizens being self-directed, is being able to say, you know, we need more time to get it right, because we all know how important it is to get something right. And, you know, the other point I wanted to touch on that that David mentioned is about the buy-in from politicians. So it's sort of a balancing act, because in Canada there's a very deep distrust of politicians on this issue for extremely good reasons. And that was another thing that helped sink the BC referendum. So sometimes, the thing with the Citizens Assembly is that because the politicians are not involved in it, that's what instills the trust. Okay. And on the other hand, the citizens in the assembly need to hear from the politicians so that they don't produce something that the major parties go, you know, over our dead body, are we going to implement that? So there's a balance to be found there in terms of coming out with an outcome that's going to be able to move forward. Can you have an assembly recommend PR without a referendum?
It depends on your political system. In our political system, in order to change our constitution, and our electoral system is written into our constitution, you would have to have a referendum. But we have a number of the recommendations of the Constitutional Convention were allowed decisions to be taken without a referendum. So it ultimately depends on what happens in Canada. Do you need a referendum to change your electoral system?
Yeah. And no, we don't. We do not. And when we had the Federal Electoral Reform Committee, most of the experts who testified did not recommend a referendum on this issue for reasons that are sort of obvious to all of us who have been around for a while. It's a very difficult way to engage and properly educate people. Citizens Assembly is totally different. It's in-depth learning, it's deliberative, whereas a referendum is just basically, partisans attacking each other and who can get their possibly misleading message out. It's not an ideal thing. So like David was saying, a lot of the recommendations from the Irish Citizens Assembly, such as on climate change, didn't call for a referendum. Riel, did you have any comment on that?
Well, I was thinking that one possibility would be for the Citizens Assembly itself to consider whether they considered that a referendum would be necessary. Because the thing about a referendum is, superficially, it is the most legitimate way to do this kind of thing. When you dig a little deeper, you realize it's got some very serious issues. But the thing is that in terms of the regular population or the media, the referendum seems to be the way to do things. So if you have the Citizens Assembly itself pronouncing itself not in favor of referendum, I think that would give that option a lot more legitimacy. It's risky. They might still recommend a referendum, but I think just like anything else, once they deliberate and learn, they'll come up with the same answer that the experts suggest.
And I think too, when we look back to, say, Ontario in 2007, we now have 7 referendums behind us. They didn't have that experience. So I'm not saying that they were naive, but I'm saying until you've seen what the politicians and the media do over and over and over, you don't exactly know how the theory works out in reality. So that, I think, would be a point too. Yeah, David.
I mean, a thing to add there is that a referendum can also help to politically anchor a decision in a way that makes it difficult to reverse. But then, as Riel said, there are all sorts of risks with a referendum. And across the water from where I am right now, in Brexit, in Britain, Brexit land as we call it here, you can see exactly the problem. Because if you have a referendum and everyone is not properly informed on what the question is, you don't get a decent outcome. I mean, they still don't know what the question is. Contrast that with our referendum on abortion in 2018. The Citizens Assembly recommended a referendum on abortion, but they went on to recommend the kind of abortion regime that should be introduced if that referendum was to pass. So when the Parliament considered its report, it drew up the draft legislation. And when the voters went to vote in 2018, they were not simply voting yes or no for abortion, they were voting with full knowledge of what legislation would follow from that. And I think for something like electoral reform, that could be very useful, that you're not saying to the citizens, vote for PR or not for PR. You're saying, here's the information produced by citizens like you about the kind of electoral system that you're being asked to vote on.
Does the shape and configuration of the room matter? So BC and Ontario had markedly different rooms.
The shape of the room, I think, is very important. That was something we innovated. So in BC, you're right, the picture you showed was from the BC one, I believe. And in Ontario, it was a lecture theatre. And in the Netherlands, it was just a big seminar room. What we did was we used a hotel ballroom. And it was set up like it would be for a wedding. And indeed, in the evening, they would have wedding parties in the same room. They just clear out our paperwork and put in the balloons. And then in the morning, the balloons will go out and the paperwork will come in for our next session. And the beauty of the round table was that everyone was sitting at the round table all the time. They were told where to sit. And at every other weekend, they would be moved around. But you were sitting at the table you were allocated. And so for the whole plenary session, when the cameras are switched on and we're hearing from the experts and we're questioning the experts, everyone is sitting at the table but looking up at the front where all that discussion is going on. But when you have the small group deliberation, the cameras are switched off, the experts leave the room, and now they're sitting in their round tables discussing among each other. I think that's such an important feature.
Did this process have an impact on young voters entering the political process?
It's hard to know, to be honest, and that because the number of cases we have in which to examine that is quite difficult. I mean, certainly from the 2 prominent Irish cases, we know from survey data that it had an impact on many voters when they went to vote. So, for example, in the abortion referendum, we know from survey data carried out on the day of the referendum, a representative sample of Irish voters, that a significant portion of those who voted for abortion were able to answer objective knowledge questions on the role of the Citizens Assembly. So that for us was a very powerful indicator of just how much it had percolated to the wider society. But of course, that's not a good example to, generalize from, because we're dealing with a very hot, emotive topic. You may not get the same kind of response for something like electoral reform. So I really couldn't say for certain.
Yeah, just to add to that, after the BC Citizens Assembly, when STV won with 58%, I'm not really convinced any more than in Ontario or anywhere else that if you had sampled voters, they could really explain how that system worked. What they got from it was that a randomly selected group of their fellow citizens had recommended this positive change to democracy, so we'll vote yes. And the media in 2005 was fairer than the media has been. So yeah, it's ideal when what the work of the Citizens Assembly in terms of knowledge translates to voters, but it's difficult on our topic.
But there is a model that's worth looking at, which is what they do in Oregon, in the state of Oregon, the Citizen Initiative Review, where, as I understand it, I've never witnessed it, but I've read a bit about it. They have the equivalent of a Citizens Assembly, a Citizen Initiative Review, to discuss the topic that is going to be voted on in a referendum. And their job is to produce a one-pager, one page summarizing the issue, what are the arguments in favor, what are the arguments against, and then that is sent to all the citizens in the state before they vote. And it's made clear to the citizens when they receive it that this has been produced by your fellow citizens in a process of deliberation. So it provides another way in which you can help to percolate this issue across the wider citizenry.
David, I have a question about that. I happened to be browsing before the webinar on some of the things that the Citizens Assembly looked at. And one of the questions was how referendums should be run.
Yeah.
And one of the critiques that I've had about referendums in Canada, the late one in particular in BC, is they allocated $500,000 for the no side and $500,000 for the yes side. And it was those two sides who had to duke it out. And that was what counted as public education. And to me, that's a serious issue. I mean, you don't get educated by listening to debates, really. I mean, you get entertained, you get manipulated, but you don't get educated. And yet, in the Irish recommendations, it sounded like it was going to be precisely that kind of process. And I was a little disappointed. I thought something like what they did in Oregon might have been more interesting. You have
Absolutely. The Irish referendum process is terrible. It's abysmal. It's badly run.
Wow.
And for that matter, many of the countries that have referendums don't run them well. There's a big piece of research being done right now by colleagues in the United Kingdom, in University College London, that's trying to come up with guidelines for a properly run referendum process. So, our problem, we use the phrase in Ireland, we are where we are. So we are with its referendum process that was designed long ago, and we have to work with it for good or ill. And unfortunately, it doesn't always produce good results. But in some cases, like these two cases I've mentioned, it did. But there's a whole separate story. You're right, Rial. There's a whole separate story about how to run referendums properly.
So I just want to reiterate, that of the about 90 countries that use PR, only 2 have actually introduced it by referendum. So it tends to be, as Justin Trudeau himself said, and he was not in favor of a referendum, that it's the people who don't want it that are yelling about how we need a referendum for, good democracy. And of course, sometimes those are the same people that put the advertisements on TV with the Nazis and all this kind of stuff when the referendum starts, right? So, even if somebody gets something in the mail, a one-pager, how that can compete with the emotional impact of being told a bunch of things on TV that aren't true. Like the Chinese community was told that if PR comes in, you're going to have to flee your home. That's the problems with referendums, in addition to obviously the huge bias going in for the status quo. So I think it's a good thing for a Citizens Assembly to look at, because obviously a Citizens Assembly wants to ensure that they represent their fellow citizens, that the voices of their fellow citizens are heard, and there's lots of ways to do that, including a referendum after people have had a chance to try the new system out, which would be another popular option, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I saw another thing. Most of us in Canada have never heard of the Irish Constitutional Convention, where a third of the members were the MPs or the TDs. Yeah. How did this happen and how did it work? And I'd also add to that question, I'd like you to talk a little bit more, David, about how the success of that, then I'm hearing, somehow led the politicians to say, okay, this isn't so bad to give this over to citizens, like nothing bad is really going to happen. Can you talk about that evolution?
So, I mean, the first thing to say here is that none of this was by some grand design. There's an awful lot of accident in the story here. I mentioned earlier on about the big crisis in our economy and newly elected government that was receptive. And that newly elected government was talking about creating a constitutional convention to carry out a major review of our constitution. And this was a government that was a coalition of two parties. Mm-hmm. And so they were compromising in designing this. And one of the parties had said very strongly in their manifesto, in their platform or program before the election, that they would have a constitutional convention that would have 1/3 members who were citizens, 1/3 experts, and 1/3 who were politicians. So when we came onto the field with our We the Citizens initiative, part of our mission was to try to persuade them that this should just be a regular citizens assembly and don't have the politicians and don't have the experts. Do what they did in BC. That was one of our sort of arguments. And we were half successful. So they accepted that the experts should be experts, not members. So the experts were taken out, the idea being that they should come in and give their expertise. But they held firmly to the line that it had to be 1/3 politicians. This was, for some reason, we'd never fully understood, but they decided to do it. And I remember at the time, I organized a conference in Dublin with Ken Carty from BC and a few others who came to talk about this thing that was about to be created. And almost all of us, myself included, were saying this was a car crash in the making. It was going to be a disaster. The politicians would take over. They would dominate all the discussions. And the only person who actually said, no, this could actually be rather good was Ken Carty. And he was, as you may know, the research director of the BC Citizens Assembly. And his argument was, there's a good thing here because it'll help to ground the process. It'll help to bring an air of realism into it. And he was absolutely right. Because you had the politicians in the room who were, you know, as part of the discussions, as part of the deliberation, who were sort of saying, yeah, but you know, do you want to see how that might work? If maybe there's some things there that we might want to reconsider in terms of other aspects we're not, you know, that they were trying to just sort of add that air of realism to the discussion, but they didn't dominate. And I can say that categorically because we surveyed the members all the way through. So we asked them a series of questions and we've carried out a very detailed analysis, and I'm happy to share the paper details to you afterwards if you want, where we try to explore if there was any evidence of the politicians dominating, and we can't find it. You know, the well-run, facilitated, deliberative process made sure that everyone had equal voices, which is what's supposed to happen. Okay, so then, to get to your other point, those 1/3 now are in the Parliament when the Citizens Assembly when the Constitutional Convention report comes back. And they're saying, yes, this is very good, we're a part of it. This is well worth considering. So we have the marriage equality referendum. But even more importantly, and I'll shut up after this, even more importantly, when we go to 2016 and there's a discussion about whether we're going to have another process, a citizens assembly, many of those people are in the Parliament still. So they're standing up from all parties and saying, this is a great idea. If we want to solve the abortion problem, which has been going on for decades in this country, we know it worked before with the last process, let's do it. So it created cheerleaders, for want of a better term, in the Parliament. And that was just a wonderful accident.
Wow. Well, you know, I have to say that when you look in hindsight, it looks like a plan. Yeah. You know, because it's you know, it started with a non-governmental citizens assembly because the politicians weren't doing it, and then it evolved to partially politicians, and then it evolved to all citizens. And now, you know, we're seeing the Irish legislature actually listening to some of those recommendations, which is really exciting too, because that's the other question people always have is, you know, is this all going to be for nothing and they're not going to listen to it anyway? So what's your experience with that been? like how many of the recommendations have actually led to some kind of significant change, other than the referendum ones, I mean?
Yeah, so the experience is pretty mixed. So there is a lot of cherry picking going on. That's just one of the big weaknesses. You can try and build in some systems to try and minimize that risk. So one of the lessons that was learned from the first process was to make it much, much clearer at the start of the second process, the Citizens Assembly, that there would be a special parliamentary committee that would consider the report on abortion and to consider the report on climate change. And so on those two items, abortion, we've already had the referendum. Climate change is now really coming to a head. The parliamentary report in response to the Citizens Assembly only came out a few weeks ago. So putting in very robust procedures that says along the lines of the Citizens Assembly will produce its report, and that report will come back to the Parliament. The Parliament will set up a special committee with members of all parties to consider it, and that will report back to the Parliament. Something along those lines helps to reduce the risk of cherry picking. But there's no doubt there are a certain amount of the recommendations of both Irish processes that were just simply ignored or rejected.
Right. So, I mean, in our case, we would be looking at one issue. So just for everybody to understand, the Irish Citizens Assembly looked at a whole bunch of issues, you know, so the politicians could pick and choose. This would be looking at one issue. And I mean, obviously, ideally, what we want is a commitment that the legislature vote in favor of the Citizens Assembly recommendation, but that kind of thing is going to be something that's going to come out of negotiations between parties. But in any case, a strong recommendation from a Citizens Assembly is really going to move the process forward in Canada. It's like it gives us a strong foundation that we haven't had at the federal level. At the federal level, people are just looking at the Politicians Committee that did the work in 2016, and that's not going to live in people's memories for very long, whereas a Citizens Assembly carries a lot of weight. Okay, is it possible for a Citizens Assembly to be set up like jury duty? So I think that's just, somebody's asking again for clarification, probably, how these people are selected. And that's really important. It's something I have to sort of repeat to people over and over because they are very worried that it's just going to be, somebody said to me the other day, self-selected, retired people with lots of time on their hands. You know, and of course the other fear is, oh my God, the politicians are going to handpick these people to deliver them the outcome they want. So can you reiterate how that worked in Ireland?
Yeah. So it is in fact the same as jury duty. It's the same system. You know, the theorists will refer to this as sortition or lottery democracy. They use different terms, lots of grand terms, but it's random selection. At the heart of this is random selection. Now, the process of random selection can vary. You know, as I understand in British Columbia, there was an initial advertising campaign and people could express their interest and their names went into a big hat, and then random selection went from that to produce the outcome. In the Irish processes, it was much more simple. They just got the electoral roll. I guess you call it the same thing. So we you know, the government have access to the electoral roll for the entire electorate in the country, and they gave the task to a market research company. It won the tender, and they said to it, you find us 99 citizens. So they literally carried out their usual procedure of door-to-door, like they would do for a door-to-door market research, you know, survey. They knocked on a door, and if you opened the door and you fitted the quota that they were Is that okay?
Are you, Riel, do you find that David is breaking up, or is that my internet? Riel, I can't hear you.
Remember how I told you about Pat would be coming home? So I thought on mute when she arrived.
Sorry, David started breaking up for me, but it might just have been my internet. Did you catch everything he said? I just want to make sure.
No, I think the last part, you got as far as talking about how you'd have a market research company selecting people, and then you broke up, and I don't think we heard the rest of it.
So basically, for the most part, all of these systems share in common that it's a stratified random selection. So you have,
Right.
you want to get 50% of your membership to be women. You want to get perhaps good ethnic representation. You want to get good regional spread, and you want to get age spread. You can set your categories, and to varying degrees, everyone who runs systems like this does it in that sort of way. But at the heart of it, it must be random selection, because otherwise you get organized interests who turn up, or the most interested who turn up, or the people who have the loudest mouths who turn up. You want to get at disorganized society. You want to get individuals who are selected by their government. It's a feeling of honor. I mean, I remember in BC, people were standing up and singing whatever anthem they would have. I'm used to this in Canadian politics, at the start of every weekend, because there was a sense of pride. They have been selected for this really important civic role by their government. And that's what you want. That's the atmosphere you want in the room.
Yeah, and I just want to speak to that too. So, I mean, there would be obviously an effort in Canada to ensure appropriate age ranges on the Citizens Assembly. Indigenous representation is important on the Citizens Assembly. And there's a very good book about the Ontario BC Citizens Assemblies called When Citizens Decide. And the researchers they surveyed, oh yeah, okay. See, I wasn't paying attention to what book it was earlier, David. But basically, they went through and showed that most of these people had not much knowledge of voting systems coming in, and that their partisan affiliation really had almost no impact on what they decided. So those things made it really trustworthy. They were really just trying to do the best they could for their fellow voters. And yeah, you get people who are extremely excited to have been randomly selected to do something like this. Let's see. I'm just looking if there's anything else on Citizens Assemblies.
Can I ask a question while you're
go for it.
That might be, rather than having dead time here. One of the things that intrigued me about the Irish process, David, was that citizens were asked. It was the same group of people who were asked to cover a whole range of issues. That seems like that's asking really a lot of people. And here in Canada, we're really only envisaging one question. Be interested to know how that worked out. Was it too much to ask
yes,
people?
In short, it was a bad idea. And it was the politicians who ran the process. People like myself were doing our best to try and steer it in a certain direction, but they were in control and they set the agenda. And we said, no, don't do that. You should follow the Canadian examples. It should be one issue at a time. And indeed, in the very, very final report of the Irish Citizens Assembly, the most recent process, the chair of that, in her report, said one lesson that she has learned from this is that if there is another one in the future in Ireland, it should just be one item.
Yeah, that's fairer to the people participating, it seems. What about the compensation? Was that generous? What was that? How did that look?
That was the other mistake in Ireland. The civil servants running it refused to pay an honorarium. So in her final report, the judge, the chair of the process, agrees with our view, which was, that's nuts. You have to pay an honorarium. You have to cover all the expenses, but you also have to give, some recompense, because citizens are giving up their time, their valuable time. It doesn't have to be a lot of money. I mean, we know from most processes it might be, $100 to $200 a weekend, but just some sort of recognition in a financial sense.
Yeah, you don't want all people turning out who are unemployed and need the money.
Exactly.
So I want to just speak to that a little bit more, because I mean, that is the exciting challenge. Don't think of it like a barrier. Think of it like, how can Canada innovate? Because we are obviously, you could probably fit Ireland, I don't know, into a small part of Ontario. So when you're talking about, say, one person, for example, from every riding across Canada, you're talking about people having to fly in to meet together for long periods of time, spending long periods of time away from their families. There does need to be sufficient compensation so that you don't just get people who financially can afford it, who don't have a job, that sort of thing, right? So all that stuff needs to be taken into account. But I have a lot of faith that there are more than enough people who would want to do that and make that contribution.
But it's important that it's not just financial recompense and all their expenses. You need to involve childcare. You need to allow for the possibility that spouses and children need to come as well. You need to have a flexibility built into it to cover all sorts of family situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's part of people seeing that, hey, you know, these people are people just like me.
Yeah.
Okay, so how was the Citizens, okay, so I've got a few different questions on Citizens Assemblies. Who decides the mandate of the Citizens Assembly? How is the Citizens Assembly funded? We could deal with those.
Yes, so the Citizens Assembly, the Irish processes, they're funded by the government. So the government picks the chair. The government has civil servants seconded from other duties to provide the service for it all, and then they're given a budget. And it's roughly the same thing as the Canadian cases. The government of the province established a Citizens Assembly. It set up its own professional team, and it was given a budget. The Irish processes, by the way, were very cheap. Each one cost about €1 million, which, when you consider that they met for 14 months in each case, €1 million is you know, a fraction of what these ones costs. But the actual cost anyway should not be.
David, you're frozen. Okay, well, while we're waiting for David to come back, I guess I could just, he will be back, I'm sure, that, you know, it is an investment in democracy. But when you think of all the money that's been, okay, I'm not going to say wasted, but, you know, $4 million for the Electoral Reform Committee to meet for 5 months so that the Liberals could have their own press conference recommending no change. You know, a whole bunch of that went to mail out those postcards that took you to a misleading survey. So, I mean, it's a small price to pay to have our fellow citizens invest some time in this compared to what's already been done, would be my opinion.
Yeah. The other question, Anita, was about who sets the agenda.
Yes.
In the Irish case, it's set by the government. It's run by the government. But that's the Irish case. There's a fascinating experiment happening in Belgium right now. There's the German-speaking communities parliament of East Belgium has established a permanent Citizens Assembly. And it has been given its own right to set its own agenda. So, you know, everything is possible.
So again, it's in, I mean, as soon as you say, well, that's up to the government, I'm sure that all the little radars on my webinar are going like along the, oh no, sort of. So a couple of reassuring things, okay? So, you know, the one would be, okay, so when I was talking about our election plan, this is why we need your help. Because the more MPs we elect who support proportional representation, who believe in this process, and who can speak knowledgeably to this, and in a minority situation negotiation, the better mandate we're going to get. The second thing is that it will be turned over to an independent, impartial third body. It will not be the government conducting the Citizens Assembly. They'll turn it over to a company like in Canada, Mass LPB, that does all the sort of processes like this, and they will do the civic lottery and organize all this stuff. So one of the key things is that it is independent. It'll be arm's length from the government. In terms of setting the question, that's really important, and that's where the politicians are going to come in and they are going to make a difference. And if you look at what happened in BC and Ontario, I mean, BC, they basically gave them free reign. Like, okay, you know, tell us what needs to be fixed and how. Sort of, it was not exactly like that, but very open. In Ontario, they had a politicians committee ahead of time that set 5 values, and they said, you guys have to base your new system on these 5 values, but you can add additional values that are important to you. I mean, in the end, I don't think it made a whole lot of difference because in the end, both assemblies prioritized the same 3 values. So that's what makes Citizens Assemblies really trustworthy, is that when you get down to the evidence on our topic, we have a long history of people prioritizing the same values and coming to similar conclusions. Okay, and I think there was just one more question, and then I think that'll be almost it for today. Other citizens' assemblies around the world, what have you seen? What can we learn?
Well, it's really only beginning to become a big thing in the last few months. So, you know, deliberative mini-publics, the Citizens Assembly is a deliberative mini-publics, have a long history. You've mentioned the Canadian examples, and, you know, you can find examples from the 1990s in the United States, in Germany, in Denmark. The particular kind of Citizens Assembly that we're talking about is a more recent phenomenon, and British Columbia was the first example of that. And in truth, the two Canadian cases, British Columbia, Ontario, the Dutch case, the Burger Forum in the Netherlands in 2006, and the two Irish processes are the full population of citizens' assemblies at a sort of big national constitutional level, if you like. What we're beginning to see in the most recent occurrences are at a city level, at a regional level. I mentioned the Belgian example a minute ago. The city of Madrid has also established a permanent citizens' assembly. The French President Macron has had a series of regional assemblies around France, and has now established a national citizens' assembly in France because of his particular difficulties. In Berlin, they're planning one. In Baden-Württemberg in Germany, they're also experimenting with examples like this. I could go on. It's beginning from climate change, you know. So it's coming alive right now.
Okay. So we didn't get all the questions, but we got most of them. A lot of the other questions are not really on the topic of this webinar. They're questions about PR or that kind of thing. So for everybody who has those kind of questions, we are happy. There's tons of information on our website. We're happy to do another webinar on proportional representation, a 101 thing like we've done before, where you can ask all those kind of questions about PR. Is there anything else for David or for Rial and myself before we sign off on either our 2019 election plan or our call for a National Citizens Assembly? And you can, I've got the chat open, and I'm kind of going back and forth to the Q&A as well.
David, while Anita's looking at that, could I ask you just clarification on your last point? What you're saying is new, sounds like, is this notion of permanent citizens assemblies.
Yeah.
That's really different from just a one-off citizens assembly. It's actually having a parallel parliament in a sense, but it's a parliament of people who are not elected for more than one time.
Yeah.
Whatever that is. I mean, permanent, what does that mean?
Yeah, so I mean, it's one of those ones where I need a pen and paper to draw it out for you, Rial, but it's called the Ost-Belgian model. So if you Google Ost-Belgian model, East Belgian model, and at its heart was the G1000, headed up by David Van Raybroek, who brought out the book Against Elections. So David got myself and a bunch of others last summer in Eupen in East Belgium to, at the request of the German Communities Parliament, to come up with an idea for a permanent citizens assembly. And it's all designed in quite considerable detail. There's a number of different chambers involved, and I wouldn't be able to describe it properly in this forum, but it's now been formally agreed that they're going to set it up.
The people who sit on this would sit for a limited period of time and are not eligible for re-election. That's how they're different from politicians. And
yeah,
so elected too, of course. Oops.
Okay.
It always cut out at the most critical times.
Oh, yeah.
At the end of that process, there's a random selection from among that group to join a more senior citizens assembly, and this is the citizens assembly that sets the agenda. And a third of its members change every time, so gradually it renews. So every 18 months it renews, and it works with a body that's established by the government, which is one removed from the government. And so their job is to keep setting the agenda. We need a citizens assembly on this. We need a citizens assembly on that. And the plan is that there would be about 2 citizens assemblies a year. And then the output of each citizens assembly is sent to the parliament for them to consider.
Right. So this relates to another question I saw where somebody was saying, well, if we get proportional representation, then because we're properly represented, does that mean we don't need citizens assemblies anymore? And I would definitely say no. They are extremely, people are getting a little bit fed up with the limits of representative democracy, even with proportional representation. It's just that we're sort of way 100 years behind in Canada and getting to that next PR step. But other countries are moving ahead of us and saying, how can we instill more trust in our political process and get feedback from people who don't have a vested interest in the outcome other than the well-being of their fellow citizens.
I agree. Citizens Assemblies are one very prominent example of how democracies can innovate, and democracies need to innovate. If we're going to prevent the challenge to democracy from getting worse, democracy needs to continuously adapt and innovate. And there's no way. The Parliament is important, and our elected representatives are at the heart of our representative system of democracy. That's a sine qua non. That is the basis of democracy. But there are occasions when it is helpful, when you're dealing with some difficult matter, for that to be taken out of the parliamentary process just temporarily, knocked around a bit in a deliberative process, and then sent back to the Parliament. And that's exactly our experience with abortion. Abortion was a problem for 3 decades in Ireland, for 5 decades in Ireland, 1983, 4 decades. It was continuously a problem. Parliament after Parliament could not resolve, how do we solve this issue of abortion in a Catholic country like ours? And it was the Citizens Assembly that did that. Just taking it out of the Parliament for a bit and then putting it back into it.
Right. And one of our takeaways from the BC referendum, among many, was that there was an exit poll done at the end, and 76% of people who voted yes or no both said that this issue should have been given to a citizens assembly. So it's the whole perception that the opponents capitalized on to the max, that this was all cooked up in the back room by the politicians who are concerned about their own power, partisan prospects. And that kind of thing has stalled electoral reform in Canada more times than I have fingers. When you sit down a politician in a room and they look at a map and they realize their riding might not exist anymore, they might have to compete for, there's 2 seats and now they might have to compete for one with their neighbor and they may be the one on the list. All of a sudden it's like, this isn't a very good time for this. I think this needs much more study, like maybe sometime in the future when people that are more engaged and blah, 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 okay? You hit that wall on the party level, on the personal career level, you hit the wall. And that's why we want to take this out of the hands of politicians, because our system is about people and about voters and about policy. It's not about 30 people's short-term career prospects. But sometimes that's what it ends up boiling down to in Canada. So that's, in Canada we have our own sort of impasse, not around abortion, but around improving our democracy, I suppose. If a party might fulfill 75% of their election promises, but I find that the 25% that weren't fulfilled were all the ones about giving more power to people, more transparency, those ones just all of a sudden get shuffled aside after the election. So this is a perfect issue for a citizens assembly. And I also want to say too that like David started with a non-governmental citizens assembly, they had that in Belgium. The G1000 was organized by citizens who were fed up with the politicians. In Iceland, there was a citizens assembly organized by citizens that led to a citizens assembly council, sort of same idea, organized by the politicians. And in the UK, the Electoral Reform Society has been pushing for a citizens assembly on Brexit, not successfully so far, but they organized their own citizens assembly on Brexit to show the politicians that citizens, randomly selected citizens, can deal with very complicated issues. Given the right information, they're just as smart and sometimes even more pragmatic, possibly, than the politicians on these difficult issues. So we citizens have to demand it. I guess that's what I'm saying. All right, Real's smiling at me. Anita's on a rant. Okay. All right, so I'm going to thank everybody for attending. I'm going to let you know that hopefully that this recorded, and I will figure out how to put it on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/FairVoteCanada. We have a playlist for all our webinars. I can send anybody the presentation or in the video if they're interested. And I just want to really thank everybody for their time. We had an exceptional amount of interest in this webinar. I think about 560 people registered for this webinar, which is, we haven't had that level of interest since before 2015, when we had three-party politicians on here. So that shows that people are really excited about this idea. They want to hear something with a plan with realistic hope. That's what we're trying to deliver here, but we cannot do it on our own. Obviously, Riel and I and David over in Ireland are not going to do this on our own. So we need your help in the ridings. We need your help talking to the candidates. We need your help getting these ideas out there. We need your financial support a lot. If you're not a monthly donor, please consider becoming a monthly donor, because your help is what makes it possible for us to do things like we just did here today. Okay. And please feel free to get in touch with us by email if you have any other questions or comments on the webinar. Riel, do you have anything else?
No, that's good. Thanks very much, Anita. It was great. I enjoyed this a lot. Thanks, David.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Riel. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.